Welcome to Digital Democracy on Tap. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. In the midst of a pandemic, the United States has seen a social movement catching fire. Tonight, we'll discuss policing in Wichita, especially in the scope of the Black Lives Matter resurgence this year. We have excellent resources for further reading and viewing from the Wichita Public Library, so check out the link for that and send us your questions or comments. We'll get to as many as we can. On our panel this evening is Dr. Michael Birzer, Law Enforcement Training Center Professor, Racial Profiling Expert, and Kenya Cox, President of the Kansas State Conference of NAACP Branches and Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, as well as Davontae Harris, cornerback for the Denver Broncos and member of Mayor Whipple's Civil Rights Advisory Council, and Chief Gordon Ramsay, head of the Wichita Police Department. Let's begin with the current state of policing and protests in Wichita. Chief Ramsay, what are your officers seeing right now, and how much active protesting does there continue to be, and how do you make room for that?
Well, the protests have really died down in the last week or two. There's a couple planned over, I think, on the 5th, but overall, they have there hasn't been as many as we were seeing. We continue to be in contact with, community activists that have planned them in the past and want to make an effort to, really make some sustained changes.
Okay. Dr. Birzer, I'd like for you to give us a sense of kind of how we arrived here with the larger picture of the movements between community policing and a more militaristic style. Can you give us a little bit of the history of policing in Kansas and nationally as well?
Sure. In the United States, we're going to have to really take a look at England in 1829. The father of the London Metropolitan Police, a guy named Robert Peel, he basically, through a Peelian reform that he enacted, said as part of that reform that the police should be organized along military lines and basically put the London police at the time in blue uniforms to distinguish them against the London or the English military, which were red and silver at the time. So the United States caught on to that. They liked it. We adopted many of those reforms here in the United States. Early on in our United States policing, and I'm saying from the late 1800s, maybe into the 1930s and 40s, policing was largely controlled by politicians. So politics and policing really mingled a lot. And politicians, large part, control police agencies. So we had reformers in the 1930s that began to really step down on the militaristic policing models, particularly within organizational designs, because they thought that was one way to begin to reform police agencies and keep the corruptive influences out of policing. In fact, in Wichita in the 1930s, we had a very progressive chief here named O.W. Wilson, who actually was one of the leaders of doing some of that. And I don't know, your listeners may not know this, but Wichita in the 1930s was dubbed nationally the West Point of law enforcement. So then we get up into the 1980s and we begin to see a movement towards what is called community-based policing. And largely it started as some foot patrol experiments in Flint, Michigan. And from there it built, and in 1994, as part of the crime bill, they allotted some $9 million to go to law enforcement agencies across the United States to hire police officers to perform community policing. Initially, it was 100,000 police officers. It never got to 100,000. But interestingly enough, when you look at what happened in the 90s with community policing, they did give a lot of money out to law enforcement agencies. In fact, Wichita and Sedgwick County here were the recipients of some of those funds, which funded a number of police officers and sheriff's deputies. But many other agencies, because there was really a lack of uniformity on how community policing was going to be implemented and really what it meant at the time, we saw some of the evaluations. If you look at those, and I was involved in some of these, not here in Kansas, but in other states, that they were using the money to buy equipment, paramilitary equipment to fight the drug war. And of course, as evaluators going in, part of that process was to look and see what you're spending the money on. And we were just kind of surprised. We were getting things like, well, methamphetamine is really becoming a problem in our area, our county, so we're going to use some of this equipment to fight that. And I understand that, but what got lost in the meantime were departments that were really truly implementing community policing as a core philosophy within their operational strategy. It was more, many departments went into it as a program where they may have 5 or 6 or 7 officers and say, hey, we're doing community policing, but really it was meant to be a total strategic way of doing policing. So with that said, we saw the military and policing get muddy again in the early 1990s when there was an agreement entered by the Department of Defense with the Department of Justice to start sharing military equipment with local law enforcement agencies. And that's when we begin to see really a takeoff in the 90s on steroids, basically.
And Chief Ramsay, before we move forward here, where you came from, you practiced community policing. Can you describe kind of what that is like when you're on the ground out there doing the community policing versus, of course, what you do now, overseeing things?
Yeah, community policing, my first position really was a big part was community policing. I was assigned to a neighborhood. I was on foot, on bike. I knew who lived where, who owned, who rented, the kids' names on a first name basis. And what I found is I was more successful as a police officer because people knew me, they trusted me, they provided me with tips on who was doing what as far as crime goes. And I was also safer as a police officer because I had so many friends in that neighborhood and that have become lifelong friends to this day. One time I was trying to arrest a subject on a warrant and I was losing, and fortunately neighbors came out of their houses to help me, including 80-year-old Fannie Mae Harris, who helped me get this guy into handcuffs. And that was very rewarding for me, as well as those lifelong relationships that I've made with people that I worked with.
So that allocation of funds is a very different picture for community policing. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Birzer. It's more about the manpower versus weaponry and tactical items.
Yes, that's the way it was intended initially. The $9 million. And by the way, I think currently there's been I think it's $14 million that have been spent or given to agencies for community policing operations.
So now all of those, facets are very interesting, of course, but the issues with race are much larger than just frictions between police and the public that they serve. Kenya, what are other elements of society, maybe housing legislation or income disparity, that play into this picture and can exacerbate some of the issues and problems that are faced?
Well, Sarah, one of the things I want to just go back and touch on, I was on the selection committee when we chose Chief Ramsay to be our new police chief. And one of the things that was so important to us that we had seen successful in our community and we've seen successful in other communities was the community policing. And so during our selection, I actually picked up the phone and called the then NAACP president in the city where Chief was living. And I said, hey, what do you know about this guy? Really, on paper, he looks great. But really, what is the community's interaction? What has it been with him? And so one of the things that he shared with me, he said that he had watched him. He was his local community police officer, and that he had engaged with the community in a way that was very affirmative to what we were looking for here in Kansas, in Wichita, and what we wanted to see promoted in our community. So that was part of why he was selected as our current police chief, because of his experience and commitment to community policing.
Excellent. Well, I do want to go here to you, Davontae, and talk about Mayor Whipple's recently created Civil Rights Advisory Council. How did you become a part of the Mayor's Advisory Council, and why was this a priority for you to participate in that?
So to be honest, I actually reached out to him. I saw some stuff on social media in regards to him formulating you mean like an advisory council, and I wanted to be a part of it. So I reached out to him. Never had really heard of him, never had really spoken to him. But I knew that I was a leader in the community, and that I needed to be a part of something in regards to that, especially with it just starting. I would be able to lay the brick of what the foundation of the group would be, and be able to push the narrative forward that we need to choose or that we need to work towards in our communities. And a big reason is because I come from the inner city, but I went to school, played in the NFL, or now play in the NFL, but I've been at every level, from being very poor to like my older brother's been incarcerated for sexual assault, things that they were accused of, that you know what I mean. But there's a mixture of things that I saw, and things that I went through in the communities, and I saw the growth from the environment that I came from, and the transition from where I came from to where I am now. And for me to have all the knowledge and insight from the situation that I've gone through, I feel like this was a perfect situation for me to be a part of, and a perfect way for me to use my leadership.
So how does your story inform the work that you're doing? Are there, instances where you yourself interacted with police that you're taking into those meetings and saying, these are things that have happened that we need to be careful about? What has your experience been with that?
Yeah, so most of what I do is kind of in the background, and certain things that I do, I try not to publicize it because I want relationships and conversations to be more genuine. So most people don't know this, but I want to say maybe a month ago, I got Chief Ramsay's information. I reached out to him, and we had a FaceTime call for an hour, and we spoke on different things that went on in the community. He learned about me, I learned about him, and it was a conversation that we had, because I felt like if I was going to be a part of the community in a huge way, I need to go directly to the source in a way that we can make direct change. And it didn't need to be this public thing where I'm saying, hey, well, I had this conversation with Chief Ramsay, and it's really just trying to push it for the media. It was more so of me trying to engage in a conversation, get to know him to get to know me, so we can find a way as community leaders to mend the community together with the police. Because before talking to him, actually, I had a conversation with my older brother, who's actually about to be shipped off to prison for like 7 to 10 years. But I had to reach out to my brother and ask him, hey, so what's the policing been like in Wichita? Is there anything that you feel like you need to say, anything that you need to get off your chest, or anything that you feel like you've been through that you felt was unjust? And he told me, for the most part, his experiences with the police officers and the police in Wichita was a pretty good experience. They treated him with respect. There's been a couple incidences to where they kind of didn't go as well, but for the most part, he took blame for whatever situation he was in, and said that the police in Wichita do mostly a good job. But I wanted to get an understanding from someone who's been in and out of the system basically their entire life, to figure out what it's like to be on the other side, and how that basically the transition happened.
Now, Chief Ramsay, the WPD First Steps Cookout in McAdams Park in 2016, this was shortly after you arrived in Wichita. It seemed to be received positively by the community overall, but what was the outcome of that? Did it ultimately help build bridges that kind of carried through today's protest environment? Has this been something, are we still building upon those first steps?
Absolutely. That many people have, years later, they're like, well, what came out of that? What was the purpose of that? Were you just placating the community? And many people forgot about the commitments we made at that day, which was, one, to create a civilian review board, which we did. During the question and answer session, an issue came up about a gang list and how to get off the gang list, and how we manage the gang list. When we had juveniles that were put on there, we didn't notify their families, their caretakers, their loved ones, and we didn't do anything to intervene. We didn't offer resources. We didn't try to get them out of the gangs. And it was very enlightening for me, being the new chief here, as well as helpful to our organization because we made those changes and they're sustained to this day on the gang list. There was several other items that came out of that effort, as well as really lifelong relationships again, where, you know, there was about 12 people that were heavily involved in that, planning that, and have met afterward and continue to meet, that we have developed just very close relationships because of it.
And so do you think those bridges are stronger now than even a few months ago, or have they been challenged in this recent time?
What we've seen is a whole new group of activists come to the table that weren't involved. Many of them 4 years ago were, you know, I'm seeing 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds that are, many of our protests were planned by young adults that age. So they weren't really around 4 years ago, and they're now finding their own voice and looking at, you know, making their own path. So we've had to go back to the table and build new relationships and share with them a lot of what we've been doing.
So now the city released a document of WPD responses online highlighting some of the work of the Civil Rights Advisory Council. Davontae, first, what are some of your the main recommendations that came out of that, from that group so far, and which ones mean the most to you personally?
In regards to trying to formulate plans and ideas and what we need to focus on in regards to the council. So our first meeting was basically trying to get an understanding and a guideline of which direction we wanted to go, because the idea was that we can all have 10 different narratives or different ideas or things that we want to push, but as a group, we need to focus on a particular idea or a particular narrative to push as a whole, because when you're trying to fight 10 different battles at once, there's a lot of information and a lot of stuff that gets lost in translation. So the basis of the first meeting was us really trying to put together like a plan and an idea of what we really wanted to do. But in the meeting, there's a big point that I really enjoyed. I can't remember what the lady's name was, but I remember her having an issue with one of the words that was a part of like the title of the group. It was the word was inclusion, and basically what she was saying was when you use that word in regards to the title of this advisory council, you're basically saying that you have power of whether I can be included or not when you say an inclusion council. So that was a big topic, and I think it was a really strong statement because it made other people realize like, hey, like you don't have to like include me. I'm a part of this regardless. I'm supposed to be in this room. I'm supposed to be a part of this conversation. So it made Mayor Whipple look into the situation like, okay, well maybe we need to change the idea of using the term inclusion, because you don't have to include me. I belong in this room. And that was basically the basis of that. But that was basically kind of the start of the council. And I think it moved and it made strides in a big way, even in the first meeting, just trying to get an understanding of what the terms were, having mutual understanding of what the meaning was, and how we can move forward as a group. And
what is the trajectory now for the group?
Is basically, so we have a meeting every other week, and I want to say last week or the week before was our very first meeting. So next week will be the following meeting. So we'll come together. They took a bunch of notes of the initial meeting, and from that meeting, all the things that everyone agreed on, we're going to basically put on the list, and from that list, we're going to choose what we want to move forward as a group, and basically be our stance and our narrative of what we push.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Chief Ramsay, I want to try to get this straight here. There's the Mayor's Advisory Council, the Wichita Civilian Review Board, which was created in 2017, and more recently, you were appointed to a commission created by Governor Kelly to examine policing and racial justice issues. Can you briefly describe the role of these different groups and how they're all kind of coming together to help inform the Wichita Police Department?
Yeah, the purpose of all of them, I believe, is to improve our system. right? Recognizing that it has shortcomings and that there is definitely a need to improve. The Governor's Commission has not met yet. We meet next week for the first time, but that is a very diverse group of people representing various fields and perspectives that is going to look at the system and our processes and funding and what the needs are, and ultimately put together a recommendation for the governor. Our Civilian Review Board looks at complaints against police officers. They get to peel back the layers. They get to see every aspect of the complaint on those that they choose and ask questions, poke prod, etc., to see how we are doing as an organization at holding ourselves and our officers accountable. And that kind of sums up those boards. And I think Davontae covered the the board he's on pretty well. So.
Are there other groups out there that are, I mean, are we just kind of hitting the tip of the iceberg here with the different activist groups that are coming together on this issue right now, or is that most of what you're working with at the moment?
No, there's a significant number of groups, and more have formed in the last month. So many, so I can't remember all their names right now, but there's probably 20 to 30 active groups that are engaging us on 8 Can't Wait, or different policy changes that we need to make.
That's a big job to kind of funnel all of the reactions and ideas from people. Kenya, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the adverse effects of racial discrimination and how it affects us all. Do you think Kansas has seen much progress on these fronts since the founding of the NAACP over 100 years ago? And what triggers those marks in progress, if you can see a pattern?
Well, absolutely, we've seen some progress, but good can't ever be the enemy of being great. If we're really going to build a society, I guess, actually, America, we really need to determine, what it is, how we want to show up in the world. We talk about building a more perfect union. Well, it's opportunities like what is going on right now that affords us that opportunity to build a more perfect union. That's why I'm so excited to hear about all of the different advocacy groups, those that are newly formed, some of those that are official, those that are non-official, because that's engaging many voices in the conversation. And those are the voices that we need to hear if we're really going to devise the type of policies and laws that are going to be responsive for the needs of all of the people. So seeing the young people and some of the more seasoned folks like myself who's been out here in the struggle and working is refreshing. And it's not a us against them, or even this conversation today, having law enforcement and subject matter academia, subject matter experts, community activists, all in a conversation on how can we be better and do better is actually what we need to address many of the issues that we're facing as related to racism. And so, when I'm thinking about the NAACP, the battle for better policing and greater accountability is one that the NAACP has been involved in since our inception. Matter of fact, our first successful case was defending a sharecropper who had an illegal police raid on his farm. So that's kind of like at our very core foundation of the work that we do. And like Davontae spoke earlier, much of what we do, we can't come out publicly. Individuals, they come to us, they feel like they have been racially profiled. We have had an ongoing relationship with all of the different administrations. Police Chief Ramsay, immediately when he came in, we got his phone number. He started attending our meetings or sending an officer there, because we understand that it's going to take all of us working collectively together to keep our community safe and to make sure people are not discriminated against.
We are collecting a whole bunch of listener questions here. Let me get to one of these here just now. Nicole via email asks, what can be done to guarantee that officers who receive multiple disciplinary actions and or are fired are not allowed to get policing jobs in another location? Does Chief Ramsay support a national registry like this, or will he use such a list to vet candidates if one is created? Chief.
Absolutely. I'm currently on the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Justice and Administration. And one of the issues that we're focusing on right now, and it is the U.S. Attorney General's priority, is to get that database done. We met a couple weeks ago to talk about how it should look, what it should look like, and if we can just get the different political parties to come together in D.C. to make it happen, I think it will, but I think it's very valuable. The problem is that in this political environment, it's very polarized, and it seems that it's difficult to get things done because it's either this party or that party. And the president signed some presidential orders that pretty much ordered this to be done. And so all that is in the works right now. I think it's a tremendous idea. We do thorough backgrounds on our hirees. We go knock on neighbors' doors. We check out ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends, trying to determine if there's any dirt or anything that we should be concerned about. We do extensive psychological testing to weed out those candidates that we don't want to be as police officers. So it is important that departments do comprehensive backgrounds and psychological screening to ensure the wrong people don't get into the profession. And I'm fully supportive of that, as well as a national database.
Go ahead, Davontae.
Okay, so Chief Ramsay, actually in Colorado, we actually recently passed a bill, I want to say about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that was about police reform, and a big part of that was us pushing a bill that included the rehiring of like basically bad police officers, and there's a bunch of stuff that went into the bill, but like us as players, like the Broncos players, we all reached out to everyone who's involved. We were kind of brought along the entire way in regards to the voting process and the bill being passed. We're educated on how to pass a bill, but I think the bill would be a really good bill for the state of Kansas. So I would like to get with you guys in regards to trying to push that exact same bill, because instead of just having the conversation, we already have the blueprint for how it's working because we pushed it in the state of Colorado. So after this, whatever, I'd like to get with you, go over the bill and maybe contact the people who we would need to reach out to in regards to getting the same bill passed in Kansas.
Dante, that's kind of where we are with the NAACP right now, and many of the community people we've been meeting with. There's been so much study done. There's been best practices, recommendations. This has been studied. Now we're really wanting to see some action. We're wanting to see some policy changes. We're wanting to see some legislation. It's time for execution, just no longer continuing to talk. We have subject matter experts like Dr. Birzer, who has studied the Wichita PD, and that can really make some real strong recommendation. It's time for follow through.
Exactly.
Davontae, I know you need to go here in a minute, but do you have anything that you can share about what your hopes are for your work on the council or outside of it? Looks like you're going to be expanding your activism in Wichita. What do you hope this will look like a year from now? Or
my hopes is that we see action more than we hear anything else. I don't want to just be a part of the council just to like have my name attached to it and make me look good. I could care less about that part. You know what I mean? Because I get enough of that in the line of work that I do. That's not my purpose. That's not my goal. That's not my narrative. Honestly, me and mostly everyone else who I talk to who's a part of it, me personally, I really don't care if I make you happy or if I make you upset or whatever it is. I want to do the right thing. I want to push the right narrative, and I want to focus on change. And change is something that is really uncomfortable, and not many people like to go through change, but change is the only way that you can maintain an actual growth. So my goal is to push a narrative or push policies that make people uncomfortable but make real change.
Thank you very much, Davontae, for sharing your perspective with us. And I know you need to get going, and we thank you very much for your time tonight. We are going to continue the conversation with the rest of our panel in a moment here. Davontae, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Right.
I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and this is Digital Democracy on Tap. We just heard from Davontae Harris, cornerback for the Denver Broncos and member of Mayor Whipple's Civil Rights Advisory Council. We will continue the conversation with Dr. Michael Birzer, Law Enforcement Training Center professor and racial profiling expert, Kenya Cox, president of the Kansas State Conference of NAACP branches and executive director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, and Chief Gordon Ramsay with the Wichita Police Department. Please join the conversation. We'll try to get to everyone's questions. And with that, I will go back to some of the audience questions. We have quite a few more to get to before we go back to my other questions. Don from Facebook asks, is limited immunity for police akin to deregulation? Will we all be more free if there are less laws? Chief Ramsay or
You broke
Dr.
in the first
Birzer?
part. What was the first half of the question?
Is limited immunity for police akin to deregulation?
Yeah, so one of the things we need to remember is we do want the best and brightest people to come into police work, right? So lately the profession has been vilified, and my concern is that we're going to lose good police officers, both that are working and then some community members that are thinking about it that are saying, I don't want to do that. And that is a big concern of mine. And one of the issues, the immunity issue covers all government employees. It's not specific to just police officers, the qualified immunity. And from my perspective, there might be some areas to tweak it a little bit, but as long as officers are well-intended and trying to do the right things, they shouldn't have to worry about someone suing them personally. And that's what that qualified immunity does. Just like a dump truck driver for the state driving down the road, if his load comes off because a wire broke or something, he should have some immunity from his employer as well. So a lot of people don't understand the intricacies of that qualified immunity. If an officer is charged with crimes, that has an impact on the potential to fall under that, meaning that if they're charged with crimes, the likelihood that they will not meet that threshold to fall under it. So, but a lot of people don't understand how it works and the importance of it for cops that are doing the right things, and that police officers that are doing the right things shouldn't have to worry about being sued. If someone is off committing crimes, charged federally or whatever, generally qualified immunity does not support them.
What is an equivalent example of a truck falling apart, for a police officer?
Equivalent would be, where the officer makes a decision and it turns out that it was well intended, but it was the wrong decision and someone gets hurt. There was no malicious intent on the officer's part to, where someone gets hurt.
Chief, I have several other questions directed at you, so let me get through a couple of these here. People want to know, so let's tell them. William via email says, what, if anything, is the chief of Wichita Police Department doing to clean up the WPD and bring fairness, transparency, effectiveness to the city manager's review board function?
Yeah, so the city manager's review board has been out of service for probably since 13 or 14. Yeah, we built a civilian review board with oversight of all of our discipline and policies to act in an advisory capacity and to see personnel data and matters that isn't always public. So
was this established in 2017? Was this?
Yes.
That one? Correct. Okay.
Yeah.
So there were a few years in between where there wasn't
Correct.
anything? Okay,
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah. So one of the big transparency items is, the civilian review board that gets to review complaints and processes and peel back the layers and help us improve.
Okay. from Chuck, I think on Facebook, says, what protections would need to be in place for you to support a civilian review board for police matters with subpoena powers?
Yeah, I think our current civilian review board is chartered appropriately, and they get to see all the everything behind the complaint, all our investigation. And ultimately, you know, I do believe that the chief has to have the ultimate authority. And if the chief isn't meeting the community's expectations, then the chief needs to go. That a review board, you know, is there to help the chief and advise the chief and be partners with the chief. But ultimately, you got to have one person that's responsible for administering discipline and running the department. And when you start having, you know, groups run the department, it becomes problematic, in my opinion. So I say if people aren't happy with the chief goes.
Dr. Birzer, I see you kind of nodding there. Is there another context or perspective that you would add to that topic?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that there has, you know, the chief is the person that has to administer the discipline. And when you get beyond that with several people involved, and that's not saying they may have input into that process and advise the chief, but ultimately it's up to the chief executive of, you know, the police department to make that decision.
Dr. Birzer, I'd like to stay with you for a moment here and talk about the distinction between racial profiling versus an officer being proactive. We talked about this briefly on the phone, and that it's something more than a difference in perspectives. Can you kind of describe that, and if there's a history there that gives proper context?
Sure. So, you know, some of my own work, 5 or so years of doing research, looking at how citizens experience, you know, racial profiling, or at least what they believe to really be racial profiling. So one of the things, you know, I heard commonly was that they were being stopped for what they called really miscellaneous types of violations, like a cracked tail light or a cracked windshield. And, you know, after several minutes, they would not get a warning, not get a ticket, and just be told, you know, you're free to go on your way. And so they would tell me, you know, what am I supposed to think? Here I am, an African-American, young African-American male, and I just get stopped and detained for 10 or 15 minutes, peppered with questions, and then told I'm free to go on my way. It's got to be about my race. So I collected data over 2 years with minority populations across Kansas. And after analyzing all of that data and putting together or coming up with some common themes that came out of the data, the second part of the study, I was commissioned to actually take that to police populations across the state and lay the data out and say, hey, look, you know, this is how citizens believe they're being racially profiled by police officers. And one of the themes that came out of my work with the police officers across the state was the fact that they termed it proactive policing, that, you know, they are going to go into areas that have high crime rates. And as a result of that, they're going to be stopping many more cars than they would in another area that doesn't have high crime rates. And they would tell me that oftentimes citizens interpreted that as racial profiling. So I think, you know, we're at a catch-22, so to speak, because in one sense, it's very real to citizens, to racial minority citizens, when they're stopped like that. And we know that there's a significant history going back many, many years in this country to where the police were used to enforce the black codes of the South and the Jim Crow laws. I mean, that's obvious. And one of the things that I discovered as well is that, you know, within the African-American family, those things are talked about early on, that the idea of what you do when you're stopped. And I submit that probably most Caucasian families, that's not a topic you talk about around the dinner table. It's just not. So it's very real. You know, I think what happens, unfortunately, there are many communities that are socially, economically disadvantaged. And unfortunately, many of those communities are where racial minorities reside. And I think police in those areas, I believe, can do a much better job if they are stopping cars in those areas with their basic skills and how they're doing that. Oftentimes, they'll stop a car on a pretext, but they'll never really give the driver the real reason after the stop has ended. And I submit that, if they would take an extra minute or two and say, hey, look, this is why I stopped you. I'm getting complaints of drugs being sold in this neighborhood or vandalisms or something. And that's why I'm stopping you this evening. And, I'm sorry, have a great evening. Really, really sorry to bother you this evening. So, and maybe even allow the motorist to have more voice into that process. And this gets into kind of a new philosophy called procedural justice, and the chief is very much aware of that. And I believe that is really a natural complement.
Describe what.
Yeah, procedural justice is a technique that when police make contact with citizens, the idea that if the citizen perceives that the contact was fair, even though, for example, they may get a ticket for some reason, they're still going to leave that stop with a pretty good impression of the police. But when they feel the police haven't been fair or transparent during that stop, they're likely to leave that stop thinking, wow, this is crazy. So I think that the skills that police officers utilize at those stops, allowing the citizen to have a little say in that. Maybe the citizen believes that, they have a say in their fate, so to speak. And then even if they get a ticket, they're less likely to hold resentment as a result of that. So it goes back to fairness. And the idea that if citizens begin to perceive fairness, then police can move towards being legitimate within those communities. And by the way, the research, if you look at the national research on that, it's fairly mixed at this point. But I think as time goes on and we have more data to look at, we'll be better, in a position to better tell if that's going to work.
Chief, I saw you nodding a little bit while Dr. Birzer was talking. Is this something that you recommend to the officers, that they make a stop like that a little bit more conversational?
Yeah, we've done a few things. One is we introduced warning tickets in 2017, which allowed officers another option, to still document the stop, but not have to give someone a citation. That was a big thing for us. But no doubt the way the traffic offender feels on these stops is part of the issue. And it's important that we do give them a voice and that we do explain who we are. And our policies kind of support that procedural justice take, where you identify yourself by name, you always explain why you were stopped, and you give the citizen opportunity to speak their mind. And there's no doubt that is, as Professor Birzer explained, is the best way to do a traffic stop, that both sides feel they were heard versus, here's your ticket, be on your way. There are ideal ways to handle traffic stops, and we have been training on that inside this department.
Chief Ramsay, I want to get into the concept of defunding the police a little bit here. It's clear that it can mean a lot of different things. What is your perspective on versions of that might be helpful in your perspective, and are there other strategies that don't involve less funding for the police that maybe people aren't talking about as much?
Yeah, well, first of all, policing is my passion, and I believe in the role that we play in society. It's sad to hear that we have people saying defund the police, but when you get beyond the terminology defund the police and pull back the curtains, we're all saying the same thing, is that we have had so many cuts to mental health treatment, to chemical dependency treatment, to homeless assistance, youth programming, the list goes on, that now a lot of these social ills falls on the back of police. We are oftentimes the social workers of first and last resort. The over-reliance on police to deal with mental health issues is astonishing in today's world. We need to fund treatment programs for people that, whether it's mental health or chemical dependency, because they are the ones that are cycling into the system. And when people talk about criminalizing homelessness, to an extent it is, because we're getting called when the homeless person's sleeping on the steps of the business. When police have to go and deal with those, sometimes they can go the wrong way, and we're not the best people to always be dealing with those sensitive situations. So we need to find in society a way to fund more social workers and assistants for those people that are struggling in life. That, I think we agree wholeheartedly with those that are saying, hey, these programs deserve the funding. I've been saying it for 20 some years as a police officer and as a chief.
And what would that look like then, that essentially the police department receives X number of $1,000 less in their budget, and those go over?
Well, keep in mind, so you got to look at benchmarks for PDs, right? So our equivalent, our comparables are Tulsa and Omaha. And both of those police departments, similar in size, similar in crime rates, have about 200 more officers than us. So to an extent, I say, you know, we are a lean organization. There's not much to cut. And if you want to do community policing, which I think our community overwhelmingly wants to see that model used, you do need more police officers to get out there on bikes and interact with kids and work on problem solving with neighbors. Community policing requires more officers than the traditional 911 response driven policing philosophy. So I'm opposed to cutting police. Now, maybe down the road if we can fund some of these programs and we can lower the call load for police, we can examine, do we need as many as we do? But you know, right now with our homeless outreach team, we've got 4 officers that work on stabilizing individuals in homelessness. And to an extent, we need a little bit of leverage sometimes to get people into treatment or to get them better. And that's where that partnership in law enforcement and criminal justice does help, because without that leverage, we're not going to see any improvement, right? Because people are suffering from addiction or fill in the blank what it is. And sometimes they need to get into the system, the court system, to get help. And that's another area that we need to talk about, is more courts to help people versus punitive, right? So people that do suffer from drug abuse, there should be options for them to get treatment versus incarceration. That's an area that we really need to expand upon and fund appropriately.
I think kind of related to this is a question from Barbara from Facebook. Camden, New Jersey has been mentioned as a good example of police reform. Can the chief and Dr. Birzer comment on changes that occurred in that city, and can we take on any of those shifts ourselves?
I'm not overly familiar with their reform efforts there in Camden, New Jersey.
The retired chief now is a friend of mine. Camden's about 75,000 people. They have very high crime rate. They had about 75 homicides a year. They had significant distrust with the community and policing, a lot of police misconduct. And what they did in like 2012 or 2011 was they just disbanded the police department and built a county-wide police department versus just a municipal department. That allowed them to create a new police contract with their police union. That allowed them to build the department from the bottom up, putting in new leadership and new officers. And the city had some substantial positive changes as a result of that, with crime reduction, community relations, and the best way that, you know, they got rid of that culture because they got rid of the whole department. And that is seen as a model for departments that are really in crisis.
Can I dovetail on that as well, quickly? Just mention that, you know, there have been, you know, agencies the last 30 or 40 years that have done, you know, really good work in reforms, if you want to use that term, reforming their agency. And Chief Ramsay, I think you're familiar with Chief Cooper's work in Madison, Wisconsin, 80s and 90s. I mean, that was my hero back reading his work at Quality Policing. He did some significant work, Chief Cooper. So, you know, it's not like, you know, models or templates aren't out there. I mean, they're there. And, but I remember reading what he was doing and just was in awe.
Yep. Yeah. And the one thing you got to remember is that our average tenure for a police chief is 3 to 5 years. And when you want to change culture, it takes 8 to 10 years to change organizational culture. Chief Cooper in Madison was there from the early 70s, I think, to 90, 93, significant amount of time, and really changed that department forever. But part of it is that sustained leadership of pushing cultural change. When you have chiefs that come in 3 to 5 years, the culture will outlive the chief.
Kenya, I'd like to come to you and see if you have some thoughts on how to engage neighborhoods of people to change the dialogue or to start one between residents and police officers. What are some tactics or ideas that you could share?
One thing that we believe in is the Citizen Review Board. And unlike the chief and Dr. Birzer, we really believe that our Citizen Review Board needs to have subpoena power, that they really need to have some teeth and some authority to be able to investigate and to really look into situations. We find that that helps if individuals in communities believe that there is somebody that really is looking into and protecting their best interests. I think that we do better all the way around. You were asking me the question related to, can you say that again, Sarah? Because I want to make sure that I speak specifically to that.
Just ways that you would, or how we might encourage dialogue between police and different neighborhoods and residents.
Well, some of the things that we've been doing here in Wichita and just across the nation is the community police model, where our police officers not only attend but community events. Currently, locally, our police officers attend our Ministerial Alliance meetings. They come to NAACP meetings. If there's community events going on, so that we can build more of a relationship with those officers, where the individuals see the officer as a member of the community and not someone that's coming from outside. And then also, when you build those types of relationships and those types of trust, then you are more likely to be able to, when there's a crime that is committed, community members will share that information. This is what's happening. Or if there's illegal activity going on in a community, if there's a trust and what community members believe is a mutual respect for their culture, for their community, and for the people in those communities, then you don't have a lot of the social unrest that we're seeing here across the nation.
I have a question from Ward asking, why are Wichita police officers not wearing face masks? It presents an uncaring attitude to the public.
Well, they're encouraged to. The reality is that it's hot out there, and oftentimes I was at a meeting today and people couldn't understand what I was saying. They asked me to, take off my mask and speak clearly. That is when you're given directions or at a scene. Sometimes that's it's hard to hear with that muffle. But with the new rules going into effect this Friday, they're not going to have much of a choice. They're going to have to be wearing them. I do know that a number of them are wearing them, and it's for everybody's health.
I have several more Facebook questions that I want to try to get to before our hour is up. Just a minute, lost my place. Gabrielle from Facebook says, Chief Ramsay, you stated June 11th of this year in a cake interview that you did not believe our police force had the same sort of system-wide problems as other forces which have been defunded and disbanded. If this is not true, can you explain why Black drivers are twice and sometimes 3 times as likely to be stopped, even in zip codes with lower populations of Black people than whites? Or why Black and Hispanic people at any given time make up more than half of those standing in front of judges at Wichita Municipal and Sedgwick County courts? And Dr. Birzer, if you want to add into this, it sounds like you might have some feedback as well after the chief.
Well, there's no doubt disparities are an issue. There's about 15 areas of disparities that I think as a society we really need to focus on, whether it be medical, employment, housing, you name it. There's disparities across the board. And when you look at disparities in the criminal justice system, we see a disproportionate amount of people of color that are victims. We see a disproportionate amount that are suspects. It goes across the board, and it's something that as a society we need to look at and do everything we can to prevent it. And as the chief, I want to be part of the solution. Now, we worked with Dr. Birzer, and I'll let him take over here on doing a deep dive into our numbers, because we want to be transparent. We want to look at these numbers. We have nothing to hide, but we definitely don't want to see this disproportionality that's occurring, and we want to figure out how to resolve it.
So you're looking at why, Dr. Birzer, why those numbers are?
Yes, the problem with that, we've looked at citation data. Sometimes it's really difficult to get a real accurate picture of stops with just looking at citations, because that's all we're looking at. We're not looking at the total number of persons who might have got stopped and didn't get a citation, or maybe those who got stopped and issued a verbal warning. So we didn't have that. That might be more telling. So when we look at just citations, really the only thing that we can compare back the citations with to really come up with a benchmark oftentimes is the census data of an area. And, in racial profiling research, we really don't like to use that because it's just not a valid form of data to use. It's got a lot of issues to it. And so to really, say that being stopped is a result of racial profiling, it takes a lot in social science to really make that conclusion. And the other thing too is, I have no way, or analysts have no way of knowing what's in the officer's heart, if there's implicit biases that he or she may be acting on. So there's a lot more to learn about, these whole dynamics of the decision to stop. And I think that's where I see research really turning in studying more of the initial decision to stop, an individual. So,
are there any policies that we already know might help with this, without knowing all of the information yet about how many stops it is, or all of the numbers? Are there some changes that we might already know should be made?
Well, the encouraging thing about the latest data that I looked at is, normally when I look at citation data for an agency, some of the things that I key in on are the minor types of violations that minority citizens have told me they believe they're being stopped for because they were Black or brown. And those would be like the cracked tail lights and things like that, getting ticketed for those types of things, failing to use your turn signal 100 feet from the intersection. And looking at the Wichita Police Department data, I didn't really see that there. And so that was a good thing. The things that really I saw were the child restraints. That was probably the highest disparity there of the drivers, at least that got citations for that. And I know that the chief is going to be addressing that here soon as well. But yeah, so looking at the data, I think it's a good snapshot in time of a couple of years of who got tickets, and it helps the police department better understand who's getting tickets for what, and they can build on that. And there are some other ways that we can, really take a look at the data if we had other forms of data to look at, stop data and things like that.
Chief, what are some of the policy changes that have come about in the last few months? Are there some things that are in the works, or some things that you've already done to resolve these issues that we're seeing?
Yeah, a lot of the items that have come up, fortunately, we've been ahead of the curve. Whether it be, the chokeholds. We don't train in it. They're forbidden. We're working on putting best language in our policies now in that regard. When it talks about duty to intervene, that is when you see another officer that is acting inappropriately, that an officer step in and push that officer aside, not only for the citizen's sake, but also for the officer's sake before there's a problem. That is now we have a policy ready to go out on that. The duty to provide first aid, in a case of an officer-involved shooting, that we do that right away is another one in the policy. And that we had been working on. We rolled out something today that I was really proud of, called the Lights On program, within partnership with another organization, where it's in a pilot area that is lower income, socioeconomic disparities, where when we pull someone over for an equipment violation with a taillight or a headlight, instead of giving them a ticket, we can give them a voucher for up to $250 to fix that item. So rather than hurting an individual and forcing them to make a decision, rent or fix this light, or that we're going to help our community out versus punitive and hurt them. It's going to be programs like this that I believe are going to help us. We've again partnered with Dr. Birzer, who's going to do the research on this project. We'd eventually like to expand it citywide, but we got to try new things. We got to look at new ways of policing, and this is an example of it.
Okay. Kenya, I want to give you the last word here, if I could, about what people can do to show their support for equality while also supporting law and order, or any last thoughts that you would have on this topic overall.
Well, Sarah, I'll just end by saying a call to end racial profiling is not just a call to end bad public policy, but it is really a call to save lives. There is a saying that justice will not be served until those unaffected are as outraged as those affected. And I think now is that's exactly what we're seeing in our nation, that there is an outrage all across the nation, and we want things to be better for all of our citizens. So I think this is an opportunity for progress for us all as a nation.
Thank you. Do you think that there are any do you have any ideas for things that people can do to take part in that change?
Well, I think one of the things that I share with a lot of the young people, and when we're out at the protest, and we just remind them that agitation and demonstration without a change in legislation, laws, or policies keep us exactly where we're at. So we just need the follow through now. We've got the attention of the nation. Now we need to act. Now's the time for us to change the laws, to change the policy, to be responsive. The research, the data is already there. We just need to go ahead and execute it.
Thank you. It is after 6 o'clock, so that is all that we have time for. We had several more questions on Facebook, and if I can coordinate with my panel to get those questions answered, I will try to do that. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and to all of you, I hope you've enjoyed our program. Next, we will be discussing back to school preparedness on Tuesday, July 14th. In the meantime, you can check out engageict.org for past videos, podcasts, and more. I'd also like to draw your attention to our 2020 election blueprint coverage. You can take a short survey there to let us know what you'd like elected officials to address. And in the context of this discussion tonight, I think that would be wonderful for you all to go there. It's at KMUW.org. Thank you again. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and thanks for joining us for Digital Democracy on Tap. Good night.